Hey there, my friend. Welcome back. Settle in. Get comfortable. Maybe pull that blanket a little closer. Tonight, I want to take you somewhere most people have never really thought about. Not in the way I'm going to show you, anyway. You've heard of the Oregon Trail. Maybe you played the old computer game in school. Maybe you know the basics. Covered wagons, wide open prairies, people heading west with big dreams and worn-out boots. But here's the thing nobody talks about. Before anyone worried about crossing a river or surviving a snowstorm, before any of that, they had to figure out how to feed their family every single day for 5 months straight, with nothing but what they could carry in a wooden wagon the size of a small bedroom. And I promise you, if you were dropped onto that trail today with no grocery store, no microwave, no running water, the thing that would scare you most wouldn't be the rattlesnakes. It would be the kitchen, or rather, the terrifying lack of one. Before we dive into tonight's story together, I just want to say, if this kind of storytelling is your thing, if you love settling in for something deep and slow and really worth your time, then maybe consider hitting that subscribe button and giving this video a like. It genuinely means the world to me, and it helps more people find their way here for nights just like this one. And hey, drop a comment and tell me where you're watching from tonight. Are you in bed already? On the couch with the lights low? I love knowing who's out there listening with me.
Now, dim those lights if you can. Find the softest spot in the room, and let's begin. Picture a farmhouse kitchen in Missouri in the spring of 1846. It's warm inside. There's a cast iron stove against the wall, the heavy, beautiful kind that took 2 strong men to carry in the day it arrived. A woman named Martha stands at that stove every morning. She knows every quirk of it, which burner runs hot, how long it takes to get the bread to golden. She's baked thousands of loaves in this kitchen, raised her children at this table. The stove is, in many ways, the heart of her home. Now, imagine her husband coming in one morning and saying, "We're leaving. We're going to Oregon, 2,000 miles west, and we're leaving in April." Martha would have stood very still for a moment. Then she would have looked at her stove, and then she would have understood, in a way that hit her somewhere deep and quiet, that the stove was not coming with her. This is where our story begins, not on the trail itself, but in the weeks before departure, in the brutal, methodical process of deciding what to bring and what to leave behind forever. And nothing in that process was more complicated, more agonizing, or more important than food. The Oregon Trail stretched roughly 2,000 miles from Independence, Missouri, all the way to the Willamette Valley in what is now the state of Oregon. The journey took somewhere between 4 and 6 months, depending on weather, terrain, the strength of your oxen, and whether fortune was smiling on you that season. Most families aimed to leave in late April or early May, early enough to clear the Rocky Mountains before the first snowfall of autumn, but late enough that there would be some prairie grass for the animals to eat along the way. That narrow window meant everything. And to survive inside that window, a family needed to carry every single thing they were going to eat for the entire journey before they had even set foot on the trail. Now, let's talk numbers, because the numbers here are genuinely staggering. The recommended food supply for one adult making the Oregon Trail journey, just one person, looked something like this: 200 pounds of flour, 100 pounds of bacon, 20 pounds of sugar, 10 pounds of coffee, 10 pounds of salt, 15 pounds of dried fruit, half a bushel of cornmeal, half a bushel of dried beans, a small amount of rice, and a few pounds of a chalky white powder called saleratus, which we'll talk about a great deal more later in our story. One person. Those numbers. Now multiply that by an entire family of 5 or 6 people. Add in the pots and pans and tools needed to actually cook all of it, and you start to understand the scale of what these families were attempting. A historian named James Miller wrote in his diary in 1848 about the provisions his group packed, and he described it simply as 200 pounds of flour for each person, 100 pounds of bacon, cornmeal, dried apples and peaches, beans, salt, pepper, rice, tea, coffee, sugar, and many smaller articles for such a trip. Reading that now, it almost sounds like a grocery list for a very enthusiastic camping trip. It wasn't. It was the calculus of survival. The wagons themselves were not the enormous sloping Conestoga wagons you might have seen in paintings. Those were freight wagons, far too large and heavy for the mountain passes ahead. Most Oregon-bound families used something smaller and more practical: a flat-bedded farm wagon roughly 10 feet long and 4 feet wide, capable of carrying somewhere between 1,500 and 2,500 pounds. That sounds like a lot of space until you realize that the food alone, just the food, could weigh anywhere from 1,300 to 1,800 pounds for a single family, which left almost no room for anything else. This is the part of the story that makes me sit with it a little. Think about what you would pack if you knew you were leaving your home forever and could only take what fit in a space the size of a walk-in closet. Most people, I imagine, would try to bring the things that mattered most to them: photographs, quilts made by grandmothers, books, furniture that had been in the family for generations, and most of those things got left behind. Or worse, they made it onto the wagon, traveled 50 or 100 miles west, and then got abandoned on the roadside when the wagon started struggling and something had to go. Travelers on the trail in the late 1840s described passing through stretches of what they called the discard road, a gauntlet of abandoned belongings stretching for miles. Rocking chairs, wardrobes, fine china packed carefully in sawdust, now sitting open to the sky. Books with their spines cracked by the sun, and iron stoves. Dozens and dozens of iron stoves. Some writers estimated that enough iron stoves were abandoned along the early sections of the trail to have built a small foundry. Those stoves were simply too heavy, too cumbersome, and too impractical for open-fire cooking to justify their weight. And so they sat there, rusting slowly in the prairie wind, silent monuments to the life that had been left behind. So if the stove was gone, if the kitchen, as these women had known them their entire lives, had been stripped away, what exactly were they supposed to cook with? The answer was spare, almost brutally simple.
Most families carried a Dutch oven. This was a heavy-lidded cast iron pot. Think of a very deep skillet with a tight-fitting lid. And it was, without exaggeration, one of the most important objects on the entire journey. A good Dutch oven could bake bread, simmer beans, fry bacon, and make soup in all one vessel over an open fire. They also carried a cast iron skillet, a coffee pot, a tin or two for mixing dough, a rolling pin, some basic cutlery, tin plates and cups, a bread pan, and a small hand-cranked coffee grinder.
And that was essentially the kitchen. No oven with a reliable temperature, no sink, no counter space, no way to refrigerate anything, no way to know whether the fire was burning at the right heat without simply guessing, adjusting, and learning from your mistakes, often with an entire hungry family watching. For most pioneer women, those first weeks of cooking on the trail were described in their diaries as shocking, not in a dramatic way, but in the quiet, grinding way that comes from realizing that skills you've spent your whole life developing no longer apply. A woman named Helen Carpenter, who kept an extraordinary journal of her journey in 1857, wrote with remarkable honesty about the gap between what she expected and what she found. She described mornings where the fire wouldn't light, afternoons where the wind scattered her ingredients, evenings where the bread came out dense as a brick despite her best efforts. She wrote about burning her hands on the Dutch oven lid, about trying to knead dough in a moving wagon, about the day her coffee pot fell into a creek and she had to spend an hour retrieving it while the rest of the wagon train moved on without her. And yet she kept cooking every single day, because that wasn't optional. Here's something I find quietly remarkable about all of this. We tend to romanticize the Oregon Trail as an adventure story, the brave pioneers, the wide open West, the spirit of manifest destiny sweeping across a continent. But when you get down to the actual daily, unglamorous reality of life on that trail, what you find at the center of it, what kept people alive, kept families together, kept morale from collapsing entirely, was a meal. A simple, hard-won, probably smoky and slightly burned meal. Every morning before the wagons started moving, usually well before dawn, sometimes as early as 4 in the morning, someone had to get up and make breakfast. That meant building a fire from whatever fuel was available, which in the early sections of the trail was usually wood gathered during the previous day's travel. It meant grinding coffee beans by hand and brewing a pot strong enough to get a tired person moving. It meant frying strips of bacon, always bacon, because cured meat was one of the only proteins that could survive weeks without refrigeration, and making biscuits or cornmeal cakes in the Dutch oven. All of this before sunrise, all of this after sleeping on the ground or cramped inside the wagon with the sounds of 100 other families doing the same thing in the dark all around you.
And then they would eat, break camp, pack everything back up, and walk. Because here's something that surprises most people when they learn it. The pioneers usually walked alongside their wagons. Riding inside was possible, but uncomfortable. The wagons had no suspension, and every rock and rut in the trail rattled through the wooden frame like a punch. So most people walked. 15 miles a day on average, in the sun, in the wind, in the rain, in the dust. And then they would stop in the late afternoon, set up camp again, build another fire, and cook dinner. One of the most revealing things about the Oregon Trail experience is the list of what people chose to prioritize when the wagon became too heavy and something had to be discarded. Furniture went first, clothing next, books and keepsakes after that. But food almost never got thrown out,
no matter how desperate things became. In the late summer, when families were crossing the brutal Nevada desert, an area that later travelers would call the terrible 40-mile desert, and when oxen were dying of thirst and heat exhaustion and people were barely moving, even then the food stayed in the wagon. Because the food wasn't just calories. The food was hope. The smell of coffee brewing at dawn was a signal to your nervous system that today was another day you had managed to survive. The sight of bread rising in the Dutch oven, slow and impossible seeming against all the chaos of trail life, was a kind of miracle that happened again and again every single day because someone decided to make it happen. A woman named Keturah Belknap, preparing for her journey in 1847, spent the weeks before departure doing something extraordinary. While her husband was managing the practical logistics of the wagon and the animals, she was in her kitchen working from early morning until late at night, cooking and preserving as much food as she could possibly carry. She wrote about frying donuts, stewing dried fruit, boiling and salting a ham, baking crackers, roasting and grinding coffee. She was building a pantry for a journey she had never taken, into a landscape she'd never seen, using skills she had developed over a lifetime in a kitchen she was about to abandon forever. I think about Keturah Belknap a lot when I think about the Oregon Trail, because what she was doing in those final weeks wasn't just packing food. She was carrying her home, the only version of it that could come with her, in a Dutch oven and a sack of flour. There's one more thing I want to leave you with before we move deeper into this story. A lot of people, when they think about why the Oregon Trail was so dangerous, why nearly 1 in 10 of the people who set out on it never arrived, assume it was the wild animals or the terrain or the hostile encounters or the dramatic river crossings. And those things were real dangers, absolutely.
But the historians who have studied the trail most carefully tend to point to something more ordinary and in some ways more chilling. It was the kitchen, or more precisely, what came out of the kitchen. The food, the water, the cooking conditions, the lack of refrigeration, the contaminated rivers, the meals prepared by exhausted, overwhelmed people with no germ theory and no understanding of foodborne illness. These were the things that killed people most consistently and most quietly along those 2,000 miles. We'll get into all of that in the parts ahead, but for now, I just want you to hold that image in your mind. A woman standing in her farmhouse kitchen, looking at her stove for the last time, understanding that everything she knows about feeding her family is about to be tested in ways she cannot yet imagine, and then turning away, walking out the door, and climbing up onto a wagon seat with a Dutch oven in her lap, ready to begin. And that, my friend, is only the beginning of what I want to show you. Because once those wagons started rolling, the real challenge wasn't the miles ahead. It was keeping a fire alive, keeping the food from spoiling, and keeping a family fed through terrain that seemed designed to defeat every single attempt. In our next part, we're going to open that Dutch oven and take a very close look at the tools these remarkable people had to work with, the ones they kept, the ones they lost, and the ones that, in the hands of a skilled pioneer woman, became something almost magical. Stay with me. We're just getting started. Something happens to a person when they lose their tools. Not just the inconvenience of it, not just the frustration, something deeper. The quiet realization that the skills they'd spent years building were tied all along to objects they never thought to appreciate. The right pan, the right heat, the right surface. Take those away, and even the most experienced cook in the world starts from almost zero. That's exactly what happened to hundreds of thousands of people on the Oregon Trail,
And tonight, I want to take you inside that experience, not as a history lesson, but as something much more intimate than that. Because the story of what these pioneers cooked with is really a story about human ingenuity under pressure, about what people do when everything familiar is stripped away and survival depends on learning fast to do things an entirely new way. So, let's talk about the tools. Let me paint you a picture that I think will stay with you. The year is 1852. A woman named Sarah Birdseye Springer is somewhere on the Great Plains, camped for the evening with her family after another long day on the trail. She's trying to make dinner. She has a fire. She has ingredients. She has the will and the knowledge and the years of experience. What she doesn't have is any of the equipment she's used her entire life. Years later, she wrote about that experience, and her words are remarkably honest. She said, "We had iron pots and tea kettles for cooking, and did our baking in a Dutch oven with coals under it and over it. It was difficult for my mother and sisters to work and cook this way, as we had been used to a large house, a cook stove, and a brick oven, and a maid to do the hard work." Read that again slowly. A large house, a cook stove, a brick oven, a maid, and now coals under it and over it. That's the gap these women crossed, not gradually over years of adjustment, but in the space of a few weeks.
The centerpiece of the trail kitchen, the object that more than any other single thing determined whether a family ate well or went hungry, was the Dutch oven. Now, if you've never cooked with a Dutch oven, let me give you a sense of what we're talking about. Because this isn't just a cooking pot. This is an engineering achievement. A proper trail Dutch oven was made entirely of cast iron, heavy, dense, almost brutally solid. A large one could weigh close to 15 pounds even before you put a single thing inside it. The lid fit with a tight seal to trap heat and moisture. And here's the detail that made it revolutionary for open-fire cooking. The lid had a slightly raised edge around its rim, a small lip that ran all the way around, specifically designed to hold hot coals on top. Think about what that means for a moment. To bake bread in a modern oven, you set a temperature, let's say 350 degrees, and the oven does the rest. The heat comes evenly from above and below. You check the clock, you wait, you pull out your loaf. A pioneer woman had none of that. What she had was this: a Dutch oven set into a bed of glowing coals with more coals heaped onto that lipped lid above. Heat from below, heat from above, and her only tools for judging temperature were experience, intuition, and the color of the flame. Too many coals on top, the bread burns on the surface and stays raw inside. Too few, it never rises properly and comes out dense and gummy. Wind changes the temperature of the fire entirely, and wind on the Great Plains isn't a gentle breeze. It's a relentless, shifting, unpredictable force that can drop a cooking fire from hot to barely warm in minutes. And this is what strikes me most whenever I really sit with this. Those women learned to do it anyway. Not perfectly, not always, and not without burning a great many meals along the way. But they learned. Within weeks of leaving home, most experienced cooks could look at a fire, feel the heat on their face, read the color of the coals, and know, without a thermometer, without a timer, without any technology at all, approximately how hot their oven was running. That's not a small thing. That's mastery built from failure in one of the harshest classrooms imaginable. Now, I want to ask you something, and I genuinely mean this as a question worth sitting with for a moment. Think about the most complicated meal you've ever cooked. Maybe it was Thanksgiving dinner with 15 things going at once. Maybe it was a dinner party where you were trying a recipe for the first time and nervously checking the oven every 5 minutes. Now, imagine doing it with one pot. One pot that you can't leave because it needs constant attention. One pot that you must use for your bread, your soup, your beans, and your pie. One pot that gets moved from fire to coals to ground and back again dozens of times a day for 5 months straight. And if you break it, drop it, crack it, or lose it, your kitchen is gone. That's what the Dutch oven meant on the Oregon Trail. It wasn't just a cooking vessel. It was the entire kitchen, the bakery, the soup pot, and the family's most important piece of survival equipment, all in one heavy, blackened, irreplaceable object. Some families actually brought 2 Dutch ovens specifically as insurance. If one cracked, and cast iron, despite its toughness, can crack under certain conditions, particularly when it goes from very hot to very cold very quickly, the second one was their lifeline. And yet, despite all of that weight and fragility and consequence, families kept the Dutch oven long after they abandoned everything else. You'll read trail diaries where a family left behind a grandfather's chair and their wedding china and half their clothing, but the Dutch oven stayed in the wagon every single time. The second great tool of the trail kitchen was the cast iron skillet. And while the Dutch oven was queen, the skillet was the everyday workhorse, the thing that actually got used every single morning before the wagon started moving. Picture a cast iron skillet from the 1840s and 1850s. Not the lightweight, pre-seasoned kind you might buy today. The originals were heavier, thicker, and built with legs. Short, stubby little feet on the base of the pan that let it sit directly in the embers of a fire without any rack or support underneath.
These were sometimes called spiders, a wonderfully descriptive name when you imagine those little legs standing in the fire. The spider skillet was used primarily for frying. Bacon, obviously. There was always bacon. Morning, noon, and often again at night. Cornmeal pancakes, which the pioneers called Johnny cakes, could be made in minutes on a hot skillet and eaten on the move. Leftover beans could be fried into a kind of cake. Fish, when someone caught one, went straight into the skillet, still wet from the river. One of the most clever uses of the skillet, and this detail I love, was for bread on a stick. When conditions made even the Dutch oven impractical, a very short rest stop, a fire that wasn't quite right, a cook who simply didn't have 20 minutes to spare, a pioneer woman could mix a quick dough of flour and water right in the flour sack, twist a lump of it around the end of a green stick, and hold it over the fire, turning it slowly. The result was a rough, smoky, slightly uneven bread that tasted of campfire and nothing else. And by all accounts, people loved it because it was warm and it was real food, and sometimes on the trail, that was enough. Now let's talk about the third great tool of the trail kitchen, and this one is the one most people never think about, the reflector oven. Unlike the Dutch oven, which works by trapping heat, and the skillet, which works by direct contact with flame, the reflector oven worked through an entirely different principle, one that was surprisingly sophisticated for its time. Imagine a tin box, roughly the size of a large shoebox, with one side completely open. The open side faces the fire. Inside, there's a small shelf where food can sit, and the back and sides of the box are polished tin, bright and reflective as a mirror. When this open side faced a fire, two things happened simultaneously. First, the direct heat from the fire radiated straight in and hit the food on the shelf. Second, the polished tin walls bounced that same heat back and forth, concentrating it, multiplying it, creating a surprisingly even cooking environment inside a box that had no lid or sealing mechanism whatsoever. It is, when you think about it, essentially a solar oven that uses fire instead of the sun. The reflector oven was particularly good for things that the Dutch oven struggled with: delicate baked goods, pies, smaller cakes and pastries. A skilled cook could use a reflector oven to make apple pie that her family would have recognized from home. And on the Oregon Trail, a slice of something familiar, something that tasted like a Sunday afternoon in Missouri, wasn't a luxury. It was medicine for the spirit. But here's the thing that really separates the trail kitchen from any cooking experience most of us have ever had. All of these tools, the Dutch oven, the spider skillet, the reflector oven, the coffee grinder, the rolling pin, the tin plates and cups, had to work together every single day in conditions that changed constantly and without warning. Rain could arrive in minutes on the prairie, not a light drizzle, a genuine Great Plains thunderstorm that turned the ground to mud, extinguished fires instantly, and reduced every ingredient that wasn't carefully stored to a sodden, unusable mess. When rain came before the fire was built, the family ate cold food. If they were lucky, that meant leftover beans and yesterday's bread. If they were unlucky, it meant hardtack, a dense, dry, utterly joyless cracker made of flour and water that has the approximate texture of a bathroom tile. Wind was its own special challenge, and one that trail cooks mentioned again and again in their diaries. A sudden gust could scatter flour across the prairie in seconds, a genuinely heartbreaking loss when flour was one of the most precious commodities in the wagon. It could blow hot coals out of position, ruining whatever was in the Dutch oven. It could carry away lightweight tin cups and utensils. One pioneer woman wrote, with an exhaustion that travels across more than 150 years of distance, that she spent more time on some days fighting the wind than she spent actually cooking. And yet, and this is what I keep coming back to, the food got made. Day after day, in the mud and the wind and the dust and the altitude and the cold and the relentless summer heat that could reach over 100 degrees on the open plains, someone built a fire and made a meal. The historian and food writer Jacqueline Williams, who spent years studying the diaries of Oregon Trail women for her book on trail cooking, described what she found with a kind of quiet awe. She wrote that to truly understand the women's contribution to the migration, you had to try to follow one of their recipes and do it over an open fire in a rainstorm. Most people who try, she noted, give up very quickly. The pioneers didn't have that option. There's one more tool I want to tell you about before we move on. One that's easy to overlook because it's so ordinary, and yet one that may have done more to keep these travelers alive than any pot or pan on the entire trail. It's the coffee grinder. Small, hand-cranked, made of iron or wood, usually bolted to the side of the chuck box at the back of the wagon. Every morning, before anything else happened, before the fire was properly established, or the bacon was sliced, or the children were roused from their blankets, The coffee grinder turned. Raw beans went in, ground coffee came out, and into the pot it went, over the fire, to brew strong and dark and hot. Now, what nobody on the trail knew, because germ theory wouldn't be widely accepted until the 1860s and 1870s, well after the peak years of Oregon Trail migration, was that boiling water kills bacteria. Cholera, typhoid, dysentery, all of the waterborne killers that claimed so many lives along the trail were destroyed by heat. The pioneers who drank their coffee were, without knowing it, also drinking water that had been rendered safe by the boiling process. The pioneers who drank directly from the rivers and streams were not. We'll get much deeper into that story later, because water on the Oregon Trail deserves its own full conversation. It's that dark and that important. But for now, I want you to hold on to this image. A small iron coffee grinder bolted to the back of a wagon, turning in someone's hands in the gray light before dawn. A tool so simple that most people would have laughed if you told them it was saving lives. What strikes me most when I think about the prairie kitchen in its entirety, this collection of heavy, battered, blackened tools rattling around in the back of a wagon, is how much knowledge and skill each of those tools required. We live in an age when cooking has largely been separated from uncertainty. We have thermometers that tell us when the chicken is done. We have ovens that maintain precise temperatures without us watching them. We have timers and refrigerators, and the ability to run out to a store if we discover mid-recipe that we're missing an ingredient. Take all of that away. Take away the electricity, the running water, the temperature control, the surplus, the ability to try again if something goes wrong. What you're left with isn't just a different way of cooking. You're left with a completely different relationship between a person and their food. One where attention can't wander, where every decision matters, where the difference between getting it right and getting it wrong isn't a disappointing dinner. It's the difference between a family that eats tonight and one that doesn't. That relationship, that intimacy between the cook and the fire and the pot and the food is something that most of us have never experienced in our own kitchens. But the women of the Oregon Trail lived inside it every single day for 5 months at a time. And most of them, bruised, exhausted, flour-dusted, and smoke-smelled as they were, managed to feed their families anyway. Now, I want to stay for just a moment with something that I think gets overlooked in how we tell this story. Because when we talk about the tools of the trail kitchen, we tend to talk about them as a list: Dutch oven, skillet, reflector oven, coffee pot, and so on. But a tool is only as powerful as the person who knows how to use it. And the people who knew how to use these tools, who had learned through years of practice in home kitchens exactly how to read a fire, how to feel for done bread without a toothpick, how to adjust a recipe on the fly when an ingredient ran low, were almost without exception women. Women who had been told their entire lives that what they did in the kitchen was ordinary, domestic, unremarkable. The Oregon Trail disagreed loudly. What these women carried in their hands and their memories wasn't just a skill set, it was the survival infrastructure of an entire migration. And the Dutch oven battered and blackened and heavy as a stone, was their most important instrument, not despite its simplicity, but because of it.
But here's the part of the story that keeps me up at night. The part that leads us directly into what comes next. All of these tools, all of this skill, all of this hard-won knowledge, and it still almost wasn't enough, because the one thing no amount of skill or equipment could solve was the question of fuel, the question of what exactly you were supposed to burn when the wood ran out. And on the Great Plains, those vast, treeless, endlessly rolling seas of grass, the wood ran out very, very quickly. What the pioneers burned instead is one of the most surprising and strangely fascinating chapters in the whole history of trail cooking. And that is exactly where we're headed next. Stay with me. Close your eyes for a second and imagine this. You've just walked 15 miles. Your feet ache in ways you didn't know feet could ache. Your children are hungry, whining, clinging to the hem of your skirt. The sun is dropping fast behind a treeless horizon, and the temperature is beginning to fall. You need to make dinner. You know how to make dinner. You have all your tools. You have your ingredients. And then you look around, and there is no wood. Not a single branch, not a twig, not a stick. In every direction, as far as your eye can see, grass. Nothing but grass. What do you do? This isn't a hypothetical question. This is the exact situation that hundreds of thousands of Oregon Trail travelers faced the moment their wagon wheels rolled out of the last of the Missouri River woodland and onto the vast, open, breathtaking, and utterly treeless Great Plains. And the answer they found, the solution that kept millions of meals cooking across 5 months of open prairie, is one of the most unexpectedly fascinating stories in all of American culinary history. Before we get into that answer, though, I want to give you a real sense of what the fuel situation actually looked like on a typical day on the trail, because it shaped every single decision about food in ways that are hard to fully appreciate unless you understand how relentless the problem was. In the early miles of the journey, leaving from Independence or St. Joseph in Missouri, firewood was relatively available. The trail followed rivers in those sections, and rivers meant trees, and trees meant fuel. Pioneers would collect wood as they walked, children carrying armloads, adults dragging larger branches, and the campfire at the end of the day was something close to ordinary, not easy, but familiar. Then the geography changed. Around the time travelers reached the Great Platte River Road in present-day Nebraska, roughly 3 to 4 weeks into the journey, the trees began to thin dramatically. Then they vanished almost entirely, and what stretched ahead of them was some 700 miles of rolling grassland, where the only natural fuel source within easy reach was something so unexpected, so psychologically confronting, that it stopped many a well-bred woman dead in her tracks. Buffalo dung. Specifically, dried buffalo dung. Hard, disc-shaped, sun-baked patties of prairie grass that had passed through the digestive system of the most abundant large animal on the continent, and then been deposited across the plains in quantities that were frankly staggering. Historians estimate that in the peak migration years of the late 1840s and early 1850s, tens of millions of bison roamed the Great Plains. Each adult bison produces somewhere between 20 and 30 pounds of waste per day. The math, if you want to do it, is considerable.
and every one of those dried patties was potential fuel. They called them chips, or sometimes, with a kind of prairie folk humor that I genuinely admire, they called them meadow muffins. And the first reaction of most immigrant women to the idea of cooking their family's supper over a fire built from these chips was, as you might imagine, not enthusiastic. There's actually a popular trail song from the period, one of those light, wry little verses that traveled from wagon to wagon the way songs do, that describes the scene. Look at her now with a pout on her lips, as daintily with her fingertips she picks for the fire some buffalo chips. That image, a woman in a calico dress, expression sour, delicately picking up fuel with the tips of her fingers as if it might bite her, captured something real about how the transition happened. Slowly, with great reluctance, and then inevitably with complete and practical acceptance. Because here's the thing that surprised nearly every traveler who wrote about it in their diaries. The chips worked remarkably well. In fact, a young Englishman named Frederick Piercy, who traveled west in the early 1850s, not as an immigrant but as an observer, wrote about the buffalo chips with something approaching scientific fascination. He noted that they were composed of masticated and digested grass dried thoroughly in the sun, and that when burned they produced a fire that was hot, steady, and this is the part that surprised everyone, almost completely odorless.
He wrote that it was a common joke on the plains that a steak cooked on these chips requires no pepper, which is a very polite way of saying the smoke tastes like absolutely nothing at all. Now, there's a detail here that I find genuinely poignant, and I want to take a moment with it. The task of collecting buffalo chips fell almost entirely to women and children, not because it was considered beneath the dignity of the men, though frontier gender dynamics were certainly complicated, but simply because of how the day was organized. The men were occupied with driving the wagons and oxen, managing the animals, scouting the trail, making repairs. And so, as the wagon train moved through the day, it was the women and children who walked alongside and gathered what they could carry. They used their aprons as baskets, vast, practical flower-printed aprons lifted at the corners and filled with fuel, carried miles and miles before being deposited by the evening campsite. One pioneer woman, Rachel Simmons, left a diary account of chip gathering that captures the experience with almost perfect clarity. She was walking alongside the trail one afternoon, collecting as many chips as she could find, when she noticed an unusually dense patch of them a short distance from the road. In the middle of gathering enthusiastically, this was a genuine discovery, fuel density being a serious concern, she heard a sound, a rattle. She looked down and found herself standing almost on top of a rattlesnake coiled in a hole beneath the chips she'd been reaching for. "I did not stop for any more chips at that time," she wrote, with the kind of understatement that only comes from someone who has genuinely been through something. But let me tell you something even more interesting about the buffalo chip situation. Something that I think reveals just how completely these travelers had to rewire their instincts. It wasn't just about overcoming disgust, it was about learning an entirely new fuel science from scratch. Buffalo chips, despite their unexpected efficiency, behaved very differently from wood. They burned hotter in some respects, but also burned faster, which meant you needed a larger quantity of them for a longer cook. They were also much more vulnerable to moisture. A chip that had been rained on was essentially useless until it dried again, and on the treeless plains there was nowhere to store them out of the weather. Wind, as always, was the enemy.
A strong prairie gust could scatter a chip fire instantly, or blow it hot in one direction and cold in another, making any kind of even cooking almost impossible. And then there was sagebrush. When chips were scarce in the higher elevations, or in sections of the trail where previous wagon trains had already collected everything available, pioneers turned to sagebrush as a backup fuel. It burned hot, which was good, but it also burned extremely fast, which meant you had to feed it almost constantly, which was exhausting. And there was one other quality that sagebrush brought to the cooking fire that nobody who experienced it ever forgot. It flavored the food. A cook on the trail actually wrote about this with the particular despair of someone who has given everything they have to produce a decent meal and been defeated by botany. I do not know which is best, it or buffalo chips. Just step out and pull a lot of sage out of your garden and build a fire in the wind and bake, boil, and fry by it, and then you will guess how we have to do. That sentence, build a fire in the wind and bake, boil, and fry by it, is about as honest a description of trail cooking as any diary has ever produced. Here's a question for you, and I mean this genuinely. Think about it for a second. When was the last time a fire in your kitchen was genuinely optional? When the stove didn't work, or the power went out, or you were camping and you thought, well, if I can't get a fire going, we simply don't eat tonight. For most of us, that's happened maybe once or twice in our lives, and it was uncomfortable, but temporary. Help was available. A restaurant was nearby. The power came back eventually. On the Oregon Trail, the fire not lighting wasn't a minor inconvenience. It was a crisis. On rainy days, and the Great Plains in spring and early summer can produce extraordinary storms, the kind where lightning hits the ground close enough to feel through the soles of your boots, and rain falls sideways and with real conviction. It was sometimes simply impossible to build a fire at all. Wet chips wouldn't light. Sagebrush wouldn't light. Even wood, if you had any, became unreliable. And on those days, the family ate cold food or no food.
One anonymous pioneer writing about crossing the plains in the late 1840s described the experience with an exhaustion that crosses the distance of nearly 2 centuries perfectly intact. He wrote, "Crossing the prairie, there was no fuel other than buffalo chips with which to cook our little meals of bread and meat. Think of cooking your supper after a long day's walk over a fire of chips with the wind blowing over the Great Plains and sometimes rain putting out the fire and going to bed without any supper. Getting up in the morning at daylight to find everything soaking wet and nothing to burn to cook your breakfast with. Hooking up the oxen and traveling until noon, trying to find some dry chips to make a fire to cook dinner. Going to bed without supper, getting up to find everything soaking wet, traveling until noon before the next meal. That's not a bad camping experience. That's a day that could genuinely weaken a person, demoralize a family, and over the accumulated weeks of a 5-month journey, slowly erode the physical reserves that stood between a traveler and serious illness. Which brings me to something that the trail diaries reveal, and that most people who think about this history have never really considered: the emotional weight of the cooking fire. On the Oregon Trail, fire wasn't just practical, it was psychological. A fire meant warmth, obviously, in the cold evenings that swept across the plains even in summer. It meant light in the darkness that fell absolute and complete across miles of empty land.
It meant community, because fires were shared, and shared fires drew people together. And people around a shared fire told stories and sang songs and remembered for an hour or two that they were still human beings with lives and histories and something to look forward to. And it meant food, not just calories, not just survival. The specific emotional comfort of a warm meal eaten together at the end of a day that had demanded everything from everyone. When the fire went out, all of that went with it. The historian Lillian Schlissel spent years analyzing the diaries of nearly 100 women who traveled westward, collecting their words and patterns into her landmark study of women's trail experiences. One of the most striking things she found was how consistently the quality of the fire appeared in women's diary entries as a kind of emotional barometer. Days with good fires and successful cooking were described warmly with a sense of accomplishment and even pleasure. Days with failed fires, wet chips, uneaten meals, those entries had a different quality altogether. Flatter, shorter, the kind of writing that comes from someone who is simply too exhausted and too dispirited to say much. The fire wasn't just fuel, the fire was morale. By the time a wagon train reached the western edge of the Great Plains and began climbing into the foothills of the Rocky Mountains, the buffalo chip era of the journey was essentially over. Trees reappeared, scrubby at first, then increasingly substantial, and the familiar smell of burning wood returned to the camp evenings. People wrote about this transition with genuine relief. After weeks or months of chip burning, the sight of actual timber felt like a kind of abundance. One pioneer wrote that the smell of a proper wood fire after so long on the chippy, smoky, wind-scattered plains was one of the finest things she had smelled in months. And then the altitude started killing the cooking. At elevation, as I mentioned briefly earlier, water boils at a lower temperature. At sea level, water boils at 212 degrees Fahrenheit. At the elevation of the South Pass through the Rockies, the route most Oregon Trail travelers used, that temperature drops to somewhere around 200 degrees. That doesn't sound like much of a difference until you're trying to cook dried beans, which need sustained high heat to soften. A pot of beans that took an hour on the Missouri plains might need 2 hours or more in the mountains. With fuel always precious and time always short, this wasn't just inconvenient, it fundamentally changed what was possible to cook and what was not. Pioneer cooks who had finally mastered the chip fire on the plains now had to learn all over again how to manage a mountain cooking fire. Longer, slower at altitude, in thinner air, with different wood that burned differently than anything they'd used before. And yet, every evening, somewhere along those 2,000 miles, in the chip lands of Nebraska, in the sage smoke of Wyoming, in the thin air mountains, in the river valleys of Idaho, a fire got built, a Dutch oven got set in the coals, something got made. Not always elegantly, not always successfully, not always enough, but made. There's one last chapter of the fuel story that I want to leave you with, because it speaks to something I find deeply human about this whole experience. As the years of the migration went on, from the early 1840s into the 1850s, the trail became, in a strange way, a shared community project. Hundreds of thousands of people using the same route meant that in some areas chips and even sagebrush became scarce from overuse. Wagon trains that arrived later in the season sometimes found the fuel supply genuinely depleted by the parties that had passed through before them. And so pioneers began a practice that I find quietly moving. When they left a campsite, they would sometimes leave behind their surplus chips, the ones they had collected but didn't use, stacked or piled near the road, visible to whoever came after them. Strangers leaving fuel for strangers they would never meet, people who were exhausted and stretched thin and worried about their own family's survival, taking a moment to think about the family in the wagon behind them, still a day away, who would need fire tonight, too. It's a small thing, a pile of dried prairie grass left by the road in 1849, but it's the kind of small thing that tells you something true about people, about what human beings do when the pressure is real and the landscape is vast and the journey is long, and they understand bone deep that nobody is going to get through it alone. That instinct to share, to prepare for those who come after, to think beyond the immediate crisis, turns out to be one of the defining qualities of life on the Oregon Trail. And it shaped not just how people fueled their fires, but how they fed each other day after day, meal after meal, through monotony and through hunger and through rain-soaked supperless nights that tested the outer edges of endurance. Which leads us quite naturally to the question of what was actually on the menu. Because once you have a fire, once you've gotten past the questions of tools and fuel and terrain and altitude and all of the other obstacles that stood between a pioneer family and a cooked meal, you still face the most fundamental question of all. What exactly are we eating tonight? And the answer on the Oregon Trail is more interesting, more creative, and more surprisingly layered than most people would ever guess. That's what comes next.
Let me ask you something right at the start of this part. Have you ever eaten the exact same meal 3 times a day for a week straight? Not by choice. Not one of those trendy elimination diets where you're feeling very virtuous about your discipline. I mean truly no choice. The same thing for breakfast, the same thing for lunch, the same thing for dinner, day after day after day. If you have, you know that something interesting happens around day 3 or 4. The food stops tasting like food and starts tasting like obligation. It stops being nourishment and starts being a reminder of everything you cannot have. And somewhere in that shift, a person begins to understand something that the pioneers of the Oregon Trail understood deeply from the very first week on the trail. That eating the same thing every single day for 150 days isn't just physically demanding, it's a test of the human spirit. The daily menu on the Oregon Trail was by almost any measure spectacularly monotonous. There's no kind way to say this, so let's just say it plainly. Breakfast, bacon, bread or biscuits, coffee, maybe cornmeal mush if time allowed. Lunch, which the pioneers called nooning, taken during the midday rest, whatever was left from breakfast, eaten cold, possibly with a handful of crackers or dried fruit. Dinner, bacon, bread, beans, coffee. Again. And then the next morning, bacon, bread, coffee. And the morning after that. The traveler Amelia Stewart Knight, who made the journey in 1853 with her husband and 7 children, kept a meticulous diary of the entire trip. It's a remarkable document, honest, wry, occasionally exhausted, and utterly real. Reading it, you start to notice something in her food entries after the first few weeks. There's a flatness to them, a resignation. She writes about meals with the same tone one might use to describe doing laundry. The menu wasn't a highlight of the day, it was simply one more thing that had to be done. Another famous trail voice Helen Carpenter, whose writing appeared briefly earlier in our story, summed up the situation with a line so perfectly dry that it's been quoted in trail histories ever since. She wrote that the only variety in the diet was a change from bread and bacon to bacon and bread. Read that again. A change from bread and bacon to bacon and bread. That, my friend, is the entire Oregon Trail menu captured in 9 words. Now, before we go any further, I want to be fair to the bacon, because bacon on the Oregon Trail was not the thin, crispy, delicately salted strip you might fry up on a Sunday morning. Trail bacon was a different creature entirely. Dense, heavily cured with salt, sometimes smoked, sometimes not, packed in large barrels filled with bran to insulate the fat from the heat of the sun. It was closer in texture and intensity to what we might today call salt pork or fatback, a thick, salty, calorie-dense slab of preserved pork that could survive weeks of prairie heat without refrigeration. It was, in the nutritional calculus of the journey, almost perfect. Fat for energy, protein for muscle, salt to help the body retain water in the sweating, walking, grinding heat of the plains. A single serving of trail bacon could fuel several miles of walking. The pioneers who dismissed it, and there were some, faced real consequences. The ones who embraced it, even grudgingly, tended to do better. One woman, named Abigail Jane Scott, writing in her diary with the honesty of someone who has come to peace with reality, put it this way: "A piece of bacon placed between 2 pieces of bread actually tastes better than the best of cakes and pies at home." That's a remarkable statement. Better than the best of cakes and pies at home? Was it really? Or had 5 weeks of monotony and exhaustion simply recalibrated her entire sense of pleasure? The psychologists among us might say it was the latter, and they're probably right. But I also think there's something else in that sentence. A decision made, consciously or not, to find satisfaction in what was available, to stop grieving what was not. That's harder than it sounds. Over 5 months, it's very hard indeed. But the monotony didn't go entirely challenged. One of the things that genuinely surprises people when they first study the food of the Oregon Trail is how much creativity existed within those narrow constraints. Because the staples, flour, bacon, beans, cornmeal, a little sugar, dried fruit, were fixed. But what a skilled cook did with those ingredients was not.
Let me tell you about butter. Many families on the trail brought a dairy cow with them tied behind the wagon. Every morning, the cow was milked. The fresh milk was poured into a bucket or small churn. The bucket was sealed and it was hung underneath the wagon. And then the wagon started moving. All day, over rocks and ruts and the uneven roll of the prairie, the wagon rocked and jolted and shook, and the milk inside that sealed bucket rocked and jolted and shook with it. And by the time the wagon stopped in the evening and someone opened that bucket, there was butter. Accidental, imperfect, sometimes slightly warm, thoroughly prairie-seasoned butter, but butter. Spread on a biscuit, that butter transformed a piece of plain bread into something that came close on certain evenings when the light was right and the fire was good and the children were quiet for a moment, to something almost luxurious. That's the alchemy of trail cooking. Not the transformation of extraordinary ingredients into extraordinary meals, but the transformation of ordinary ingredients through patience and ingenuity into something that felt briefly like abundance. The beans deserve their own moment too, and I want to give it to them. Dried beans, usually navy beans or pinto beans, though varieties differed from wagon to wagon, were one of the genuine workhorses of the trail diet. Heavy in the bag, yes. Slow to cook, absolutely.
but once cooked, they were filling in a deep, satisfying way that nothing else on the trail quite matched. Beans have protein, they have fiber, they have a substance and staying power that kept a walking body moving long after a lighter meal might have been burned through. The standard trail technique was to start the beans soaking in the morning before the wagons moved out. Then, during the nooning rest, they were put over a fire to begin cooking. By the time the wagon trains circled up for the evening, if everything went to plan, and on the trail things often didn't, the beans were ready. But here's a detail that I find genuinely clever. The beans were almost never eaten plain. Bacon fat went in, a little molasses if there was any, wild onions when they could be found near the trail, occasionally a handful of herbs packed back in Missouri when someone had the foresight, even a splash of vinegar, which trail cooks knew intuitively helped preserve food and brighten flavors long before anyone understood the chemistry of why that worked. The result wasn't fancy, but it was real cooking. The act of taking simple things and making them into something more than the sum of their parts. And then there were the special days. If you've ever wondered what kept people mentally together over 5 months of bacon and beans and cornmeal mush, part of the answer is this: they celebrated. Not because there was always something to celebrate, but because the act of marking a day as different from all the others, of saying, today we cook something special, today we make a feast out of what little we have, was one of the most powerful psychological tools available on the trail. The 4th of July was the great occasion. Every year, no matter where the wagon train happened to be, whether on the Nebraska plains or in the Wyoming mountains or somewhere in the baking alkali desert, the 4th of July was honored. And what the women of those wagon trains produced for those celebrations, from the same limited ingredients they'd been working with for weeks, is one of the most quietly extraordinary achievements in the whole history of trail cooking. E.W. Conyers traveled the trail in 1852, and his diary gives us a detailed account of a 4th of July feast celebrated near Independence Rock in Wyoming, a dramatic granite landmark that was itself a traditional halfway point of the journey. The women of his wagon train outdid themselves entirely. The menu he recorded reads like a dispatch from a different world. Roast antelope, roast sage hen, roast rabbit, antelope stew, jackrabbit stew, antelope pot pie, sage hen fried, jackrabbit fried, white bread, graham bread, warm rolls fresh from the oven, pound cake, fruit cake, jelly cake, peach pie, apple pie, strawberry pie, custard, a dozen or more varieties of cake and pie not individually named, coffee, tea, chocolate, and then, and this is the detail that delights me most, someone had thought to collect snow from a nearby mountain stream. They mixed that snow with milk and peppermint and sugar, and they made ice cream. Ice cream, 1,000 miles from any city in 1852 on the Oregon Trail. Conyers wrote with the particular satisfaction of a man who has eaten very well that it was not too bad for a people 1,000 miles from civilization, a magnificent understatement. Across the same years, a man named William Swain, traveling in 1849, recorded his 4th of July dinner with similar enthusiasm. His party sat down to ham, boiled and baked beans, biscuits, johnny cake, apple pie, sweet cake, rice pudding, pickles, vinegar, pepper sauce and mustard, coffee, sugar, and milk.
Now compare that to the daily diet of bacon and bread. The ingredients were largely the same. The beans were the same beans they ate every other day. The flour was the same flour. The bacon had become ham, which was the same cut of meat prepared differently, and yet
the effect was completely transformed. Not just the food itself, but the meaning of the food and what it did to the people sitting around that fire on that particular evening in the middle of the American wilderness. This is something worth sitting with for a moment because it tells us something true, not just about the Oregon Trail, but about what food actually is. Food isn't just nutrition. It isn't just fuel. It's the story we tell ourselves about who we are and how we're doing, and whether life, despite everything, is still worth something. On the ordinary days, the story was bacon and bread, simple, sustaining, honest. On the 4th of July, for a few hours, the story was ice cream and antelope pie and warm rolls. And that difference, that small, enormous difference, was enough to carry people forward. There's one more food tradition of the Oregon Trail that I want to tell you about, and it's one that most people have never heard of: the wagon train whiskey. Almost every wagon on the trail carried alcohol, not in secret, openly listed in the supply inventories with perfect candor. The official reason was medicinal, and there's some truth to that. In an era before reliable pain medication, whiskey was genuinely used to treat injuries, infections, and the various ailments that accumulated over months of hard travel. But the unofficial reason, which several diarists acknowledge with a kind of cheerful honesty, was simply that life on the trail was hard, and a small measure of whiskey at the end of a long day made the bacon taste better and the stars look prettier. Trail diarist Addison Crane described the general practice with a wonderful dryness. He wrote that most immigrants took, quote, 5 to 10 gallons of whiskey to a wagon under the notion that by mixing it with the bad water, it becomes in some mysterious way healthy and purified. And then there was the invention of a trail drink called skull varnish. This was whiskey mixed with molasses, consumed in modest quantities and apparently quite popular. The name alone tells you something about the people who drank it. People with a sense of humor, people who weren't taking themselves too seriously, people who had decided that if you were going to travel 2,000 miles across a continent on a wooden wagon, you might as well give your drinks entertaining names. Skull varnish.
I want to pause here because I think this part of the story gets at something that's easy to miss if you focus only on the hardship. The people on the Oregon Trail were not simply suffering through their diet. They were thinking about it, writing about it, arguing about it, celebrating with it, and finding ways, small, creative, often ingenious ways, to make it mean something. One woman carefully saved her sugar ration for weeks so she could make a proper cake for her daughter's birthday. Another improvised a pie from dried pumpkin and trail spices that her children talked about for the rest of the journey. Someone brought a tiny tin of peppermint oil packed deep in the wagon and used it sparingly, reverently, to flavor the occasional sweet and to make, once, a batch of trail peppermint candy that became the highlight of a particular Sunday rest. These were not people who had given up on pleasure. These were people who had redefined it, stripped it down to its essential bones, and found that even there, in the most reduced and difficult circumstances, it was still possible to cook something that made a child smile or a tired husband look up from his plate with something like surprise on his face. That surprise, that moment of, oh, this is actually good, in the middle of all that hardship. I think that's one of the most human things I know. And yet, for all the creativity and celebration, and the 4th of July ice cream and the skull varnish, there was a truth running underneath the trail diet that couldn't be wished away by good cooking. After weeks and then months of this food, rich in salt and fat and carbohydrate, but desperately short on fresh vegetables, on fruit, on the vitamins and minerals that a working body needs to stay healthy, the cracks began to show. Not immediately,
not obviously, but quietly, in the weeks after the journey reached its midpoint, in the tired eyes and the bleeding gums and the aching joints and the strange exhaustion that didn't seem to lift even after a good night's sleep. The body was keeping its own accounting of what it had been given and what it had been denied. And the accounting that played out silently across the second half of the journey is one of the most important and least told stories of what it actually meant to cook and eat on the Oregon Trail. Now I want to talk about bread, because bread on the Oregon Trail deserves more than a passing mention. Bread was civilization. Bread was home. Bread was the thing that separated a meal from simply eating to survive. Somewhere in a small home bakery in Spokane, Washington, a woman named Stacy Kearney is feeding a sourdough starter. She does this regularly, with the kind of gentle care you might give to something fragile and irreplaceable. A bit of flour, a bit of water, a stir, a rest, and then she waits for the living culture to wake up and do what it's been doing for longer than anyone alive today has been breathing.
Because this particular sourdough starter, this bubbling, fermenting, improbably alive mixture of flour and wild yeast, was first carried west from Missouri in the year 1847 by a woman making the Oregon Trail journey with her family. It crossed rivers and mountains and desert. It traveled in a covered wagon for 5 months across 2,000 miles. It survived everything the trail could throw at it, and it's still alive today. That story, the story of bread on the Oregon Trail, is one of the most quietly extraordinary chapters in this whole journey we've been taking together. To understand why bread mattered so much, you have to understand what the pioneers were leaving behind when they set out. In the mid-19th century, bread was the foundation of the American diet in a way that's difficult to fully appreciate today. Not bread as an accompaniment, a side dish, something you eat while waiting for the main course. Bread as the main course. Bread as the thing around which every other food organized itself. The average American family in the 1840s consumed enormous quantities of it. Dense, dark, substantial loaves baked in brick ovens that held heat for hours, producing a crust and a crumb that modern bread rarely achieves. It was the last thing many pioneer women baked before leaving home, and the first thing they tried to recreate on the trail. The problem they faced was fundamental, and it came down to a single question that every baker understands the moment they start thinking about it. How do you make bread rise? At home, the answer was yeast. Wet yeast supplied by local breweries was the standard leavening agent of the day. A packet of it added to dough would work its quiet biological magic overnight, producing a loaf that was light and airy, and, when baked in a proper brick oven, truly beautiful. The problem with wet yeast on the Oregon Trail was simple and absolute. It died. Bread yeasts in the 1840s were caked or wet cultures, and they had virtually no shelf life without refrigeration. At the temperatures of a prairie summer, which could easily exceed 100 degrees in the wagon during the day, wet yeast was useless within days of purchase. There was no way to keep it alive across 5 months of travel. So pioneers needed something else, and what they found, or rather what they carried with them, was one of the most ingenious leavening solutions in the history of baking. The first solution was sourdough.
Sourdough is one of the oldest bread-making technologies in human history. Its principle is simple. You create a starter, a mixture of flour and water that captures wild yeast from the air and from the flour itself, and you keep that starter alive by feeding it regularly. The wild yeast in the starter ferments the dough, producing carbon dioxide that makes the bread rise. And the same fermentation produces lactic acid, which gives the bread its characteristic sour flavor. A well-maintained sourdough starter is effectively immortal. It doesn't require refrigeration to survive. It requires feeding. Give it flour and water at regular intervals, keep it in a container that breathes, and it will go on living essentially forever. And forever isn't a casual word here. The sourdough starter that Stacy Kearney feeds in her Spokane bakery, the one that Carl Griffith inherited from his great-grandmother who carried it west on the Oregon Trail in 1847, has been continuously alive and baking for nearly 180 years. 180 years. The microorganisms in that culture were fermenting flour before the American Civil War, before the telephone, before the automobile, before nearly every technology we now consider basic to modern life. They've been alive, quietly and persistently, through everything. I find that almost impossible to hold in my mind without a kind of awe. Now, maintaining a sourdough starter on the Oregon Trail was not straightforward. It required a level of consistency that trail life constantly threatened to disrupt. A pioneer woman named Lydia Arnold Titus, who traveled the trail and kept detailed notes of her experience, left us one of the most vivid descriptions of how it actually worked in practice. She wrote, "When we camped, I made rising and set it on warm ground. It would be up about midnight. I would get up and put it to a sponge. In the morning, first thing, I would mix the dough and put it in the reflector oven. With good hot coals, the breads or cakes for a hearty breakfast were ready by the time the men rounded up the teams." Read that again and notice what she's describing. She set the starter to rise during the evening while the family slept. She woke at midnight to check it. She began mixing dough first thing in the morning while the camp was still waking. By the time the animals were hitched and the wagon was ready to move, the bread was baked. All of this, every single day, for months, without a single day off, because the starter needed to be fed and the family needed to be fed. And those two facts were non-negotiable, regardless of how tired or sick or discouraged a person felt. There's also another technique mentioned by several trail women that I find wonderfully practical. Instead of maintaining the starter in a separate jar, they simply kept a lump of unbaked dough tucked down into the flour sack. The dough would ferment quietly in the flour, staying alive and active. When the cook needed to bake, she pulled out the lump of dough, mixed it with fresh flour and water to make a new batch, and then tucked a fresh piece of the new dough back into the flour for the next day. A perpetual machine, self-sustaining, requiring nothing but flour, water, and the daily intention to keep it going. But sourdough wasn't the only leavening solution on the trail, and in many ways, the second solution is even more surprising. In the year 1840, just barely early enough to be commercially available when the Great Migration began, a product called saleratus began appearing on the shelves of general stores across the American Midwest. It was a white, slightly chalky powder, and its chemical name was sodium bicarbonate. We know it today as baking soda, but in the 1840s it was new, barely understood, not yet trusted by most cooks who'd never used anything like it in their lives, and were frankly skeptical of anything that promised to raise bread so quickly and so easily. The principle of saleratus was straightforward chemistry. When this alkaline powder came into contact with an acidic ingredient, sour milk, vinegar,
the tangy residue of a sourdough culture, a chemical reaction produced carbon dioxide gas. Those bubbles expanded in the heat of baking and pushed the dough upward, creating rise without any living yeast at all. The resulting bread was different from sourdough, less complex in flavor, denser in texture, but it was fast, critically fast for a trail cook who needed bread on the table in 30 minutes and had no time to wait for a long fermentation. And with high heat, it worked remarkably well. The standard trail recommendation was 2 pounds of saleratus per adult per journey. That sounds like a lot until you realize how quickly it could be used up when every loaf of bread, every biscuit, every batch of pancakes depended on it.
And here's the detail of the saleratus story that I genuinely love and almost nobody knows. When the commercial supply ran out, when those 2 pounds were gone and the nearest store was 300 miles away, the pioneers discovered that the landscape of Wyoming had been hiding a secret all along. Near Independence Rock, one of the great landmarks of the trail, there are a series of shallow lakes. In dry seasons, the beds of those lakes are crusted with white mineral deposits, thin, crumbly, crystalline stuff that dusted the ground like snow and blew in the wind and irritated the eyes and noses of the animals. The pioneers discovered through a combination of observation and experiment that this white crust was saleratus, natural, geological, absolutely free, and present in quantities so large that a pioneer could fill a bucket in minutes. A Mormon diarist named Norton Jacob, traveling through the area in June of 1847, described stopping at one of these soda springs with something approaching scientific excitement. He wrote that the pool was surrounded by a substance white as snow that answers every purpose of saleratus, and that he gathered a full bucket of it in a very short time. Another traveler, a physician named Tice Gelwicks, investigated the saleratus lakes with even greater curiosity when he passed through in 1850. He found beds of pure crystalline mineral, some of them several inches deep. He pushed his walking cane into the ground to test their depth. He jumped on the crust to watch water spring up through the surface. He was, by all accounts, genuinely delighted. And William Clayton, the principal diarist for the Mormon Pioneer Company of 1847, noted that the natural saleratus smelled strongly like lye, he said, or brine, but that it was said to raise bread equal to the best bought in Eastern markets. There was one catch, and it's a wonderful one. The natural saleratus, when mixed into bread dough, sometimes turned the bread a faint pale green. The pioneers ate it anyway.
When you're 5 weeks in to a 5-month journey, and the choice is between green bread and no bread, you eat the green bread, and you're thankful for it. Can I ask you something while we're on the subject of bread? Think about the last time you made bread, or tried to make bread, or decided to buy a loaf from the store because making bread seemed like too much work. What was the hardest part? Was it finding time? Not knowing whether the yeast was still active? Worrying about whether it would rise? Getting the oven temperature right? Now take all of those concerns and add a campfire instead of an oven, a 20-mile walk, wind, altitude, uncertain fuel, a starter that needed to be nursed back to life every single night, and the knowledge that if this batch failed, your family's breakfast was a cold, stale biscuit from 2 days ago. And then ask yourself, would you still bake? The pioneer women did, every single day. And in doing so, they weren't just making food, They were insisting in the most practical and daily way imaginable that this journey wasn't going to strip away the things that made life worth living. Warm bread was one of those things, maybe the most important one. There's a story about hardtack that I want to tell you here, because hardtack is the shadow side of trail bread, the thing that sat in the wagon as insurance, as backup, as the option of absolute last resort. Hardtack was among the oldest foods in human history. Sailors had been eating it since at least the time of ancient maritime exploration. Armies had carried it on campaign for centuries. It was made of almost nothing: flour, water, a pinch of salt, mixed into a stiff dough, cut into crackers, and baked for a very long time at low heat until every trace of moisture was driven out of it. The result was a cracker so hard that it could break a tooth if you bit into it incautiously, so dense that you could literally drive nails with it, so utterly flavorless that it inspired universal contempt from everyone who ever had to eat it regularly. It had one overwhelming virtue: it lasted forever. A properly baked piece of hardtack, kept dry, had been documented to survive years, even decades, without spoiling. During the American Civil War, soldiers on both sides ate hardtack from the same batches that had been sitting in storage since before the war began, and found it perfectly edible, if perfectly horrible. On the Oregon Trail, you softened hardtack by dunking it in coffee until it became something approaching chewable, or you fried it in bacon fat until the exterior crisped and the interior warmed, or you crumbled it into water and called it mush and tried not to think about what you were eating. One diarist wrote simply, "Hard bread manufactured at St. Louis is bad, always very bad. I believe nobody eats it except when unavoidable." And yet, people packed it and people ate it, because when the sourdough starter died, and the saleratus ran out, and the fire wouldn't light, and the rain wouldn't stop, hardtack was the thing that stood between a family and nothing. Hardtack was the floor, not the ceiling, not the aspiration, not the thing anyone dreamed about on the 4th of July, but the floor. I want to come back to that 1847 sourdough starter for a moment, because I think it contains something important about why bread, in particular, carried so much weight on the Oregon Trail. When Carl Griffith's great-grandmother packed that starter in her wagon in 1847, she was doing something she may not have fully understood the significance of. She was carrying a living thing, a colony of organisms that had been raised in her kitchen, that had been fed on the same flour she used, that had risen and fallen with the seasons of her home across an entire continent. She was carrying a piece of her home that was literally alive. And when she arrived in Oregon, when the wagon stopped and the journey was finally over, and she unpacked what was left of her life into a new place, that starter was still there, still alive, still ready to make bread, ready to make in a new land the first loaf of something that tasted like home. There's a reason that sourdough starters passed from hand to hand across generations have always been called by the name of the person who first tended them: Carl's starter, not the 1847 starter, Carl's. Because they're not just yeast and bacteria, they're a continuous thread of human attention and care, stretching backward through time. And the thread that runs through Carl's starter runs all the way back to a covered wagon on the Oregon Trail, and a woman who understood in the middle of everything that bread was worth keeping alive. Now, let's talk about hunting. Because if you ask most people what they imagine pioneers ate on the Oregon Trail, the answer you'll often get is buffalo, wild game, fresh meat roasted over a campfire under the stars. And there's some truth to that, but the reality, as always, is more complicated and more interesting than the mythology. Picture the Great Plains in the summer of 1843, not as they look today, cross-fenced, farmed, overlaid with roads and towns and the quiet geometry of modern agriculture. Picture them as they were then, an ocean of grass stretching from horizon to horizon in every direction, enormous and seemingly without end. And into that extraordinary, impossible landscape, with 50 rifles and 50 men who'd grown up on farms in Missouri and Illinois and never hunted anything larger than a deer, the wagon trains rolled west. And the real question, the one that determined whether fresh meat would grace the cooking fire that evening or whether it'd be bacon and beans again for the 400th time, was simply this: could anyone actually hit one?
Hunting on the Oregon Trail was one of the great masculine fantasies of the westward migration, and one of its most frequently humbling realities. Here's something that the diaries reveal with a consistency that becomes almost comic after a while. The men were desperate to hunt buffalo, genuinely, almost feverishly desperate. Many of them had spent their whole lives reading the adventure stories of explorers and frontiersmen, hearing tales of the great western hunt, imagining themselves as Daniel Boone striding across the wilderness with a rifle in hand. The buffalo was the ultimate prize, massive, iconic, and apparently plentiful beyond imagination. And so, at the first sighting of a herd, chaos would erupt. An American documentary source from the period captures what typically happened. The sighting of buffalo would trigger what can only be described as a stampede, not of the buffalo, but of the men. Out onto the prairie they would race, on horseback or on foot, with varying degrees of skill and no shortage of enthusiasm. In many cases, by all accounts, they managed to miss an animal the size of a small car, standing more or less still at distances that should have been manageable. A trail historian summarized the scene with dry precision. By the late 1840s, it had become something of an irony on the trail. Trigger-happy would-be frontiersmen racing around the prairie with firearms they barely knew how to use, trying to hunt an animal so large it was difficult to miss, and missing it repeatedly. There's something both funny and sobering about that image. Funny because human beings chasing buffalo in a disorganized frenzy on the open plains, falling off horses and losing hats, and firing at unfortunate angles, does produce a certain comedy. Sobering because those men needed that meat, and when they failed to get it, the family ate beans that night again. But the hunters who succeeded, and many did, especially those with genuine frontier experience or who traveled with skilled guides, those hunts produced something almost miraculous for the cooking fire. A single adult bison killed cleanly and efficiently could yield up to 450 pounds of usable meat. 450 pounds. For a wagon train of 30 or 40 families, a single successful hunt was a feast. And not just one night's feast, because that much fresh meat in the heat of a prairie summer couldn't possibly be consumed before it spoiled. Which is where one of the oldest food preservation technologies in human history came back into service. The surplus meat was cut into strips, long, thin, the thickness of a finger, and hung from ropes stretched between the wagons. And there in the open air and the hot sun and the relentless prairie wind, it dried.
One pioneer described the sight that a successful wagon train presented after a good hunt. Every wagon in the train looked, she said, as though it was decorated with red fringe. Hundreds of strips of drying buffalo meat hanging from the sides and the tops and the backboards of every vehicle in the line, fluttering gently in the breeze as the whole procession moved west. Red fringe. Two words that somehow say everything about the ingenuity and the beauty and the improbable dignity of life on the Oregon Trail. The dried meat that resulted from this process was jerky, and here the pioneers were unknowingly rediscovering and adopting a technology that indigenous peoples across the Americas had developed and refined over thousands of years. The word jerky itself comes from the Quechua word charqui, used by the Inca people of South America, which meant dried, salted meat. When the first Europeans arrived in the Americas and encountered indigenous peoples who'd been making preserved meat for millennia, they recognized immediately that this was a technology of profound practical value. Portable, calorie-dense, shelf-stable without refrigeration, and the product of a skill that native peoples had refined to near perfection. On the Oregon Trail, the knowledge transfer happened organically through trade and observation and the kind of practical exchange that occurred whenever pioneers and indigenous communities interacted peacefully, which, despite what Western mythology often suggests, happened far more often than most people realize. The most sophisticated version of this preserved meat technology was pemmican. Where jerky was simply dried meat, pemmican was something more engineered. Dried meat pounded into a fine powder mixed with rendered fat, usually tallow or bone marrow, and sometimes with dried berries for flavor and additional nutrition. The result was dense, calorie-rich, genuinely shelf-stable almost indefinitely, and capable of sustaining a working adult on very little volume. Pemmican was the energy bar of the 19th century, and the people who knew how to make it properly, who had learned the technique from indigenous communities or from experienced guides who'd learned it from them, had an enormous nutritional advantage over those who hadn't. But I want to come back to the buffalo for a moment, because there's a dimension of this story that doesn't get told often enough, and that I think changes how you see the whole thing.
The bison that the Oregon Trail pioneers were hunting were not simply an abundant food source on an empty landscape. They were the foundation of the entire economy and survival system of dozens of Native American nations who'd lived in relationship with those herds for centuries. The Pawnee, who had farmed and hunted along the Platte River Valley for generations, depended on the bison for food, shelter, tools, and clothing. The Lakota Sioux, the Cheyenne, the Arapaho, the Comanche further south, these were peoples whose entire material culture was organized around the buffalo, not as a hunting prize, but as a relationship carefully maintained across generations. The Reverend Parrish, who found the sight of the buffalo herd so overwhelming that words failed him, was witnessing something that was already beginning to disappear by the time he saw it. The great herds were being hunted out of eastern Kansas before the immigration had even fully begun. The traffic of the trail, the presence of hundreds of thousands of people and their livestock moving through the same corridor year after year was disrupting the seasonal patterns that the herds and the people who depended on them had developed over centuries. By 1884, within 40 years of the peak of the Oregon Trail migration, the American bison population, which had numbered somewhere between 30 and 60 million animals, had been reduced to approximately 325. 325, from 30 million to 325 in less than half a century. The red fringe on the pioneer wagons wasn't just a triumph of preservation technique. It was, in ways that nobody on the trail fully understood at the time, also the beginning of an extinction, and of the destruction of the food systems and the civilizations that depended on those animals. That's a heavy thing to hold,
and I think it's worth holding, even in a story about cooking. Now, back to the question of what the hunters actually brought home and how it was cooked. Fresh bison meat was, by every account in the trail diaries, a transformative event in the culinary life of the wagon train. After weeks of bacon and beans and cornmeal mush, the arrival of fresh red meat at the cooking fire produced a kind of collective euphoria that multiple diarists tried and largely failed to fully capture.
One traveler described the first bison stew of the journey as the finest meal I've eaten since leaving Missouri. Another said simply that buffalo hump ribs roasted over coals want no seasoning. Several noted that even people who had claimed to be indifferent to the monotony of trail food found themselves unable to conceal their delight at fresh meat night. The preferred cuts were the hump ribs, the fatty, richly flavored ribs from the distinctive shoulder hump of the bison, and the tongue, which was considered a delicacy and often reserved for the wagon master or the most skilled hunter as a kind of informal tribute. The liver was eaten immediately, often raw or barely cooked, because the trail cooks knew intuitively what we now understand scientifically. Organ meat is extraordinarily rich in vitamins and minerals that dried and preserved foods simply can't provide. What I find remarkable about this is that the pioneer cooks were making nutritional decisions based entirely on taste and intuition and inherited knowledge, without any of the scientific framework we would use today to explain those decisions. They ate the liver because it tasted good and made them feel strong. They didn't know about vitamin A or iron or the specific mechanisms by which organ meat replenishes what months of dried food can't supply. They just knew it worked, and they were right. Let me ask you something. Have you ever had a meal that arrived at exactly the right moment, after a long, difficult day when you were more exhausted than hungry, when you'd almost given up caring about what was for dinner, and found that the meal somehow tasted better than any meal had a right to taste? That's what fresh bison was to the Oregon Trail. Not because the cooking was sophisticated, not because anyone had managed to bring herbs or sauces or anything that would have impressed a restaurant critic, but because the context was perfect. The weeks of sameness, the accumulated hunger for something different, the simple biological fact of protein-rich fresh meat after a long period without it, combined to make a piece of meat roasted over a buffalo chip fire taste to the people eating it like the finest thing they'd ever put in their mouths. This is one of the things I find most deeply human about the Oregon Trail story, the way that circumstance transforms the experience of food, the way that hunger and effort and scarcity recalibrate the senses so completely that a piece of well-cooked bison hump becomes, in the honest memory of the person eating it, something approaching perfection. The hunting story, however, had a shadow side. As the years of the migration progressed from the early 1840s into the 1850s, the bison that had seemed so overwhelmingly abundant in the early years began to retreat from the trail corridor. The first thing to go was the eastern sections. By the late 1840s, travelers who had read accounts from earlier years and packed light in anticipation of plentiful game found themselves crossing hundreds of miles of the Great Plains without seeing a single bison.
The men who had loaded up on ammunition and fantasized about the great western hunt came back to camp empty-handed night after night, to a dinner that was once again bacon and beans. The irony compounded. The very success of the migration, the sheer number of people using the trail, was depleting the resource that made the trail manageable. And so we arrive at the part of this story that I've been circling around for the last hour, the part that explains why some families arrived in Oregon healthy and others didn't. Why some people walked the entire 2,000 miles and stepped off the trail with energy still in their step, and why others barely made it, weakened by something they couldn't see and didn't understand. It comes down to water. Of all the dangers that waited on the Oregon Trail, this one had no warning sound, no rattle in the grass, no crack of a rifle from a distant ridge, no rumble of a coming storm. It came invisibly through the most ordinary act imaginable, the act of lifting a cup to your lips and drinking. And by the time you knew it had found you, you had perhaps 6 hours left to live. The Oregon Trail followed rivers for most of its length, not by accident, but by absolute necessity. The Platte River in Nebraska, the North Platte into Wyoming, the Sweetwater, the Snake River in Idaho. The route was, in many ways, a river route, and the rivers made the journey possible by providing a continuous, reliable water source across 2,000 miles of otherwise arid and unpredictable terrain. The problem was that the rivers were, by the standards of the migration's peak years in the late 1840s and early 1850s, catastrophically filthy, and I don't use that word casually. By the summer of 1849, tens of thousands of people and hundreds of thousands of animals, oxen, horses, mules, cattle, sheep, were moving westward along the same routes in the same season. They camped at the same riverbanks, drank from the same tributaries, washed their clothing in the same streams, and buried their dead on the same ground. Everything they produced, every form of human and animal waste, every discarded food scrap, every dead animal carcass went into or near or upstream of the same water source that the next wagon train would arrive at the following morning and drink from. The description of the Platte River that appears most frequently in the trail diaries of the period is one that's been passed down as a kind of grim joke. The river, travelers said, was too thick to drink and too thin to plow. That's a very polite way to describe what the Platte actually was in those years. A traveler named Cecilia Adams, writing in 1852, described the Platte more directly. A very muddy stream, she called it, though she added with remarkable practicality that it could be clarified enough for drinking by treating it with alum, a chemical that caused the suspended particles to clump together and settle to the bottom. Generally, she wrote, we get a pint of mud out of every pail of water. A pint of mud per pail. That they drank it anyway tells you everything about the available alternatives. But the mud was the least of the problem. The mud was visible, and visible things could be worked around. The real danger was invisible, colorless, odorless, present in the water long after it looked perfectly clear and tasted at worst slightly off. The real danger was a bacterium called Vibrio cholera. Cholera had been traveling the world for decades by the time it reached the Oregon Trail. It had originated, most historians believe, in the river delta regions of Bengal in India and spread westward along trade routes in the early 19th century, arriving in the United States for the first time in 1832. By 1849, the year the California gold rush began, and the traffic on the overland trails multiplied several times over almost instantly, cholera had established itself along the Missouri River Valley and was poised to travel west with the migration. It did in a brutally efficient way that still makes epidemiologists shudder when they study it. The symptoms of cholera are violent and rapid.
What begins as an abdominal cramp, the kind you might attribute to something you ate, the kind that might make you lie down for a while and expect to feel better, accelerates within hours into uncontrollable vomiting and diarrhea, so severe that the body loses fluids faster than it can possibly be replenished.
The dehydration that results is catastrophic. The skin shrivels, the eyes sink, the lips turn blue, the voice drops to a whisper, and then, in many cases, silence. George Gibbs, who traveled to Oregon in 1852, described the stretch of trail along the Platte in terms that have haunted readers ever since. He wrote, "For 400 miles, the road was almost a solid graveyard." 400 miles of graves. A diary from 1850 recorded a traveler who counted 21 freshly dug graves in just 18 miles of trail. Another traveler wrote that he was scarcely out of sight of grave diggers during entire days of travel along the north side of the Platte. Now, here's a question I want to sit with for a moment, because I think it's the most important one in this entire story. Why did the cholera kill some people and not others? Two travelers side by side on the same trail, drinking from the same river, eating similar food. One dies within hours, the other reaches Oregon in good health. The answer, which no one understood at the time, and which took another decade and a half of science to fully explain, was terrifyingly simple. It came down to what they boiled. The bacterium that causes cholera is destroyed by heat. Boiling water for as little as 1 minute kills it completely. And the people who regularly boiled their water before drinking it, the people who made strong coffee every morning, who cooked their beans in water brought to a full rolling boil, who never drank directly from a river without treating it first, were, without knowing why, protecting themselves. The people who drank straight from the Platte because it looked clear enough today were not. This is the great, quiet irony that runs through the entire water story of the Oregon Trail. The pioneers who survived were often the ones with the strongest coffee habits. Not because coffee had any inherent protective quality, though some pioneers believed this and argued for it vigorously, but because making coffee required boiling water, and boiling water, for reasons no one yet understood, made it safe. By 1854, 5 years after the worst cholera epidemic on the trail, a British physician named John Snow had mapped a cholera outbreak in London to a single contaminated water pump on Broad Street, and proved for the first time with solid evidence that cholera spread through water and not through air, as most doctors then believed. His work would eventually revolutionize public health around the world, but it came 5 years too late for the tens of thousands who died along the Platte. Let me tell you about one family, because statistics, as real as they are, have a way of becoming abstract in the mind, and what happened to individual people on that trail was not abstract at all. In June of 1852, a woman named Martha Friel wrote a letter home that has survived in the historical record as one of the most heartbreaking documents of the entire migration. She was writing from somewhere on the trail, and she was trying to explain what had happened to her family in a span of less than 2 weeks. She wrote, quote, "First of all, Frances Friel died June 4th, and Maria Friel followed the 6th.
Next came Polly Castner, who died the 9th, and Lafayette Friel soon followed. He died the 10th. Elizabeth Friel, wife of Amos, died the 11th, and her baby died the 17th. 7 people, 13 days, all of cholera. And then, with a kind of impossible resilience that appears again and again in the trail diaries, thank God we're all well and likely to do well, for we've had no sickness since the baby died. No sickness since the baby died. They moved on because stopping wasn't an option. Because the window to cross the mountains before winter didn't care about grief. Because there were people still alive who needed water and food and someone to make breakfast before the wagons started moving again at 4 in the morning. The geography of cholera along the Oregon Trail was not random. Historians and epidemiologists who have studied the pattern of deaths mapped from the thousands of diary accounts that mention them have found that the disease clustered heavily along the Platte River Valley in Nebraska and eastern Wyoming, and became dramatically less common once travelers passed Fort Laramie and began climbing to higher elevation. There are several reasons for this. At higher altitude, the temperatures fell, and Vibrio cholerae survives less well in cold water. The population density dropped as faster travelers pulled ahead and slower ones fell behind, reducing the concentration of contamination at any single water source. And the character of the water sources changed. Mountain streams fed by snowmelt were generally cleaner than the slow, sluggish Platte. But the other factor was one that no pioneer would have been able to articulate: the alkali chemistry of the Platte itself, which created conditions that actually helped the cholera bacterium survive and spread in ways that cleaner water did not. The same mineral chemistry that made the Platte water difficult to drink also made it a more effective vehicle for the disease that was killing the people who drank it. There was also the alkali problem, entirely separate from cholera and in its own way equally dangerous. Across the desert stretches of Wyoming and what is now Idaho, the trail passed through regions where the groundwater and the water in shallow pools was so heavily saturated with alkali mineral salts that it was poisonous, not mildly unpleasant, poisonous. Animals who drank from alkali pools could die within hours, their legs giving out beneath them, their lips and tongues blistering, their internal organs failing in a progression that was both rapid and agonizing. Oxen, the indispensable engines of the wagon train, were particularly vulnerable, and losing an ox to alkali water could strand a family in the middle of the desert with no way to move their wagon forward. Pioneer cooks developed desperate strategies to manage the alkali stretches. Vinegar was added to water to neutralize the alkalinity before cooking, which is why nearly every trail packing list included at least a small keg of vinegar, and why a cook who ran out of it faced genuine danger. Bacon fat was sometimes given to sick animals as a kind of crude antidote, with mixed results. And whenever possible, travelers would push through the worst alkali stretches without stopping to drink, covering 30 or 40 miles in a single desperate push with no water for anyone, human or animal, until they reached safer sources on the other side.
The 40-mile desert stretches of the trail, the ones that come up again and again in the diaries as the single most terrifying section of the journey, were not primarily terrifying because of heat or rattlesnakes or the sheer emptiness of the landscape. They were terrifying because of what happened when you ran out of safe water. And through all of this, the cholera along the Platte, the alkali in the desert, the mud that turned every clear-looking pool into a potential death sentence, the cooking still had to happen. Breakfast still needed to be made. Beans still needed to be soaked.
Bread still needed water in the dough. Coffee still needed to brew. And so the women who cooked, who were already managing fires and tools and altitude and wind and fuel and 100 other variables, also had to manage water, had to assess every source they camped near, had to decide with no chemistry, no test strips, no scientific training of any kind, whether the water in front of them was going to feed their family or kill them. The trail diarist Abigail Scott, writing on June the 8th, 1852, put it as clearly as anyone ever has. She wrote, "The great cause of diarrhea, which has proven to be so fatal on the road, has been occasioned in most instances by drinking water from holes dug in the riverbank and along marshes. Immigrants should be very careful of this." She was right. She was completely right. And she wrote it without any knowledge of germ theory, without understanding what bacteria were, without knowing the name of the organism that was killing her fellow travelers. She just knew that something in the water was doing it, and she told people to be careful. I think about that a lot when I think about the Oregon Trail, about how much these people understood intuitively about things that the science of their time had not yet explained, about the quiet wisdom that accumulated in the trail diaries. This woman's observation about riverbank water, that man's note about staying upwind of the cooking fire, someone else's careful documentation of which streams ran clean and which ran dangerous. They were building a body of knowledge through experience and loss in real time, one grave at a time. And some of that knowledge saved lives, even though the people who acted on it couldn't have told you exactly why. The story of water on the Oregon Trail is, in the end, the story about the limits of what human beings can protect themselves from when they don't yet have the right tools to understand what is threatening them. And it's also a story about something else, about the fact that the people who thrived were often the ones who treated every cup of water with the same care and attention they brought to their bread and their beans and their fire. The people who stayed curious, who stayed cautious, who understood even without knowing why, that paying attention to the ordinary things, the daily unremarkable acts of cooking and eating and drinking, was exactly what kept people alive. And so we come to the end of this long journey together. Not the end of the Oregon Trail itself. That stretched on for another 1,000 miles through the Blue Mountains and down the Columbia River and into the Willamette Valley. But the end of this particular story. The story of what it meant to cook and eat and survive on one of the most difficult journeys in American history. What strikes me most when I sit with all of this, all the tools and the fuel and the bread and the beans and the water and the hunting and the monotony and the celebration and the loss, is how much of the Oregon Trail experience came down to food. Not as background, not as something that happened while the real story unfolded elsewhere. Food was the story. The act of making a meal every single day for 5 months in conditions that seemed designed to make that impossible was the thing that held families together, kept morale from collapsing, and determined who arrived in Oregon and who didn't. The women who cooked on the Oregon Trail were not just feeding people. They were keeping civilization alive in a moving wagon. They were insisting, through the most practical and unglamorous labor imaginable, that home wasn't a place you left behind. It was something you carried with you in a Dutch oven and a sourdough starter and the muscle memory of how to make bread rise, even when the wind was scattering your flour and the fire was dying and the children were crying and the whole world felt like it was trying to defeat you. And they did it. Day after day, mile after mile,
2,000 miles of fires and meals and burned fingers and smoky clothes and exhaustion so deep it lived in the bones. They did it. That sourdough starter that's still alive in Spokane, that's not just yeast. That's a message sent across 180 years from a woman who understood something important. That bread matters. That the small daily acts of care matter. That what you feed people and how you feed them is never just about calories. It's about saying, you are worth this effort. You are worth getting up at 4 in the morning to grind coffee and build a fire and make something warm before the day begins. You are worth keeping alive. And I think that's the thing I want you to take with you as you drift off tonight. Not the hardship, though the hardship was real. Not the disease or the monotony or the graves along the Platte, though those are part of the story too. What I want you to remember is the red fringe fluttering in the prairie wind, the smell of coffee at dawn, the 4th of July ice cream made from snow and peppermint, and someone's absolute refusal to let the wilderness take away all last bit of joy. The green bread that tasted like hope. The woman who woke at midnight to check her starter because the bread mattered more than sleep. The pile of buffalo chips left by the side of the trail for the family coming behind. That's what people do. That's what people have always done. They cook, they share, they find a way to make something out of almost nothing, and they keep going. The Oregon Trail was not won by the people with the most courage or the most guns or the most romantic notions of manifest destiny. It was won by the people who knew how to keep a fire alive, how to make bread rise at altitude, how to boil water without understanding why, and how to feed a family every single day, no matter what. And if you've stayed with me through this whole long story, if you're still here listening in the quiet of your room with the lights low and sleep not far away, then I think you understand something now that most people never think about. That the Oregon Trail wasn't about covered wagons and wide open spaces. It was about a Dutch oven and a bag of flour, and a woman standing in front of a fire at 4 in the morning, deciding that today, like every day before it, her family was going to eat. And that, my friend, is a story worth telling. Thank you for being here. Thank you for listening. And may your own fire, whatever form it takes, burn steady and warm. Good night.